For marketers to really excel at building brands that drive business growth on the continent, they need to understand the people they are trying to market to. They need to get under the skin of the consumers in the markets they are entering. What makes them tick, what excites them, and what makes them pay attention? Well, to discuss African attitudes, marketing beyond the numbers, is David Blyth, CEO of Yellowwood, a strategy consulting company. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you,
Glad to meet you today.
Nice to meet you too.
Now, in your paper, you talk about dispelling the myths about Africa when marketing brands. And exactly what do you mean when you say there's no such thing as the African consumer?
Well, it's interesting when you think about the African consumer, when a lot of people talk about the African consumer as this general volume of people, over 1 billion people on the continent. And we refer to it as if people are all the same. And that can't be true. And if you just think about the fact that we speak over 2,000 different languages on the continent, and that's a conservative estimate, it's a proxy to show that actually there's incredible diversity in who we are, what languages we speak, where we come from, what our backgrounds are. We might come from a subsistence environment or a multicultural melting pot of an inner city environment. And our worlds are very, very different. And from the research we've done, it's very clear that you cannot compare, let alone Africa, to another continent. But you can't compare the countries and the people inside Africa to one another.
So you're saying you have to take culture and all of that into account. I had an interesting discussion with someone else on this topic.
Yes.
And he maintained that consumers all over the world are the same.
Well, I would completely disagree with that. Unfortunately, we never really hear of people talking about the European consumer. Mm-hmm. And in media reports, people don't say, well, the South American customer is like X. It can't be that. They talk about Chile or they talk about Brazil. But when people refer to Africa, and it's often the case when people are looking at Africa from the outside in and seeing it as this place on a map, that is an opportunity to find new consumers. And they tend to group them together as a kind of globular set of people who become a target audience.
So what are some of the other myths that need to be dispelled about Africa?
Well, it's the one that's close to our hearts, which we really feel strongly about, is that people often see Africa as a volume game. And we often hear this talk about the bottom of the pyramid and how big this market is. And in 2100, they're going to be not 1 billion people, but 4. And in countries like Tanzania, it's going to move from 43 million people to 270 odd million people. And automatically, our marketing and commercial and capitalist mindsets go, wow, what can I make from that? Imagine if I could make $1.
So mass production.
And mass produce and take our manufacturing mechanisms from international markets and replicate them 55 times across the countries in Africa.
But that would seem like the logical way forward if you want to make money and if you're looking at demographics.
Sure.
What's wrong with that?
What's wrong with that is it's assuming that there is $10 to take from someone's wallet, when often there isn't. So displacement is a misnomer. It's not growth. In Africa, we've got volumes of people, yes, but not volumes of currency necessarily, if you compare it to a $20 trillion market like the US or North America. So marketers have to think about creating value, putting $10 back into people's wallets or pockets, rather than extracting money. And that's a very different way of approaching marketing.
It is indeed, yes. Yeah. So it's about creating opportunities.
Creating opportunities, whether it be access to new products and services, opportunities for people to earn new incomes, create networks of localized production that help people in their local environment, and tackle things in a way which is not necessarily a cut and paste model that exists in other countries because it works there.
Okay, so it's not about the product, it's more about the opportunities that can be created.
Absolutely.
Let's look at the big brands. What big brands stand out for you in terms of those that are following this trend that you're talking about?
Across Africa?
Yes.
Well, one that we like to mention quite a lot is ShopRite, because they've had some very hard lessons in their growth strategy across Africa, but they're doing an amazing job in terms of providing relevant access to the right kinds of products and services, including customizing shop format depending on the environment that they're going into. So understanding that a consumer walking into a mall in Acacia in Lagos is a very different person to one that might be walking into a mall in Nairobi in Kenya.
Give us a sense of some of the African archetype consumers that you talk about in your research work.
Well, we developed...
That can assist marketers that want to get their brand out there in Africa.
Absolutely. Now, Sheena, we did an exercise, and we've done work on multiple sectors across 17 different countries in Africa, and working with real consumer data. So many data points to look at and to understand. And on top of that, we added another 1,400 survey mobile questionnaire just to check our thinking and to make sure that there's validity in what we were assuming as hypotheses. And out of that, we built 8 different archetypes. People that represent a typology, if you like, of a kind of consumer that would have certain types of needs, wants, an outlook on life. So, for example, an optimist is an example of one of those particular segments. And these people could range from being, a taxi driver in your local, in Accra, for example, who really proudly drives you around and points out the local points of interest and does his job incredibly well, but takes pride in his local environment, but is actually quite jovial and convivial in his approach and quite talkative. So we've understood that as one type of consumer archetype. They're the kinds of individuals who do seek change in the world around them, but they are perhaps more community driven than about themselves. So they like to connect and talk and interact with others.
Interesting. Let's move to South Africa, Africa's powerhouse.
Yes.
The economy has diversified so much since 1994.
Yes.
How much has changed in terms of brands, and how are they keeping up with this change when it comes to marketing their brands in South Africa?
Now, Sheena, a lot has changed. And in the last 10 years, let alone the last 20 years, I mean, the shifts in our demography are incredible in terms of what the middle class now looks like and the makeup and profile of that middle class. We're wealthier on the whole, but actually we're more diverse than we were in those days, which is actually quite an incongruency if you think about it logically. And a lot of people assume that from 1994 till 2014, if you look at that as a 20-year period, that people have become more homogeneous. And actually post-94 and all the people that are born post-94 are going to be more like one another. And that's so not true. And from the research we see, people that are born after that date are obviously less like their parents and their historical kind of communities, but are not necessarily more like their peers. They're actually more different because they have wider choice, many more access points in terms of information and knowledge and actually buying opportunities and brands.
And they're probably more individualistic.
Yes.
As opposed to be, wanting to form part of a trend that's been there for quite some time, or community orientated. They probably have their own mindsets, the Born Frees.
That's very, very true.
So they're going to be picky and choosy, and it's going to be hard to please the Born Frees as consumers.
Absolutely. Look, in any market with income, as income increases, so does the shift from community-driven to individual-driven also change in a linear way. So people move from being community-focused to individual focus. But in other markets across the world, that becomes quite a self-centered thing, and to the point of even being, I guess, narcissistic in some communities. But in Africa, what's interesting from the research we've done, and in South Africa as well, where people never ever lose their relationship with the community. So instead of it being a break from being community focused, it's actually an interdependence between myself and the community. So that's a very interesting observation. We also don't believe that Born Frees is a valid description of people, because it's in a sense a bit of an unfortunate term, because it assumes that people have no memory.
Sure.
And that there's ground zero in 1994, and that everything's a clean slate, and therefore people
want to understand the history as well, and want to
Yeah, people have a
connect with
history.
it, and you need to connect with that.
People
yeah.
have a history, and you can't put that aside and say it didn't happen or doesn't exist. We need to rather understand, what does it mean to them, and how does that affect their purchase decisions, relationships with brands, their understanding of their role in the community, their belief systems, their attitudes. It's so important, when you say get under the skin, to really get to grips with that stuff if you're going to be relevant. And let's face it, I mean, if you can't be relevant today as a marketer, you might as well go home, because you're not going to be providing anything of value to the end customer.
So a little bit about Yellowwood Strategy.
Yes.
Exactly how far do you extend yourself on the continent in terms of your strategy consulting side of the business?
Yes. Well, we have a very small boutique company. It is only 25 people. We're very research and insight focused, with strategy delivery competency. But that is very much housed at the moment in South Africa. So we have a Cape Town office, a Johannesburg office, and a Nairobi office. But we're doing work right across the continent with many clients. Our plan is to put roots down where we can, with local partners in other markets, as we can, and as we can grow with the customers we're working with.
Well, we wish you all the best in your endeavors. It was a big pleasure to meet you today.
Thank you very much, Nashi.
Thank you for being on the show.